Hi, Todd Stern. Thanks so much for coming in. The first question, in the book, you talk a lot about some of these crisis points where the talks nearly break down, where the whole process of climate negotiation will break down. How did you get through those moments of crisis, both in diplomatic sense, but also in a personal sense, given the amount of energy and effort it takes to run these negotiations?
Yeah, so I usually had a pretty clear sense in my mind of what we needed to get, what we needed to prevent, both of those things. You know, you try to find some way to make some kind of forward progress. The Copenhagen Accord was done sort of at the last minute. It almost was buried, and instead we managed to give it a quality that allowed it to be referred to and looked at and to be meaningful going forward. And that was a start for what ultimately came to be the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement itself and the Paris COP was the biggest highlight, because we got something done that, frankly, countries had been trying to do since 1995. So that was historic and important.
One of the big themes of your book is the personal relationships you built with a set of really important negotiators, whether in the UK, in India, but particularly in China. Yeah, how do you reflect on that?
You have to understand when you're negotiating with somebody from another country that they are operating under instructions from their country, so they're not going to go like wildly off the path of what their basic instructions are. But within that reality, different individuals can make a real difference. In the case of China, I didn't spend as much time with anybody else in the world as I spent with Minister Xi Jinping. We very early on kind of hit it off in a personal way. I mean, dozens and dozens and dozens of meetings over the years. Look, the most important thing you can do, for starters, is you have to listen. You can't just come into a meeting wanting to talk. You've got to listen, and really listen from the perspective that you're standing in the other guy's shoes, and that your counterpart thinks that you are understanding them and trying to meet them in the middle.
How did you balance the restrictions on US politics and policy, even when you had strong leadership at the top, with the positions of other countries? And how do you feel other people understand or didn't understand the US?
You know, I had a clear sense of what was possible and what wasn't. There was only so far that we could lean in the direction of other countries, even if they really cared about it a lot, because if we didn't do it the right way, we would get right back into the problem that I was determined not to repeat, which was U.S. says yes to the agreement and then can't join. That's the single most important kind of conviction that I brought into this job. And I knew that created a lot of unhappiness on the part of other countries who specifically wanted some of those things to happen. And I wasn't unmindful of that, and I wasn't even unsympathetic to it. It's just that I knew where we could give and where we could not give.
What would be the lessons you took for why Paris worked, previous attempts to do a similar thing hadn't worked? So what are the big lessons of how to kind of prepare for success?
I think, for starters, there was time that was built into the process of this negotiation. The mandate for it was set in South Africa in 2011, so it was a 4-year mandate. If you think about the mandate that was supposed to lead to a deal in Copenhagen was 2 years. So the 4 years gave us an opportunity to introduce ideas and proposals for the way to approach things, and to have some of those even actually approved in COPs, in conferences leading up to Paris. I think that made things a lot easier. It was vital that this finally work, vital for climate change, but really vital for multilateralism, which a tremendous number of countries out of the 195 really, really care about. Because if you think about smaller countries, this is their way to have a voice. I think that countries both had the comfort of knowing where this was going in terms of issues, having a deep kind of tangible feeling that we cannot let this fail. We have to get this done. So that's the second thing. The third thing I would say is that there was a bilateral negotiation that went on in 2014 for most of the year, 10 months, secret. It was between the US and China. The idea which we put to the Chinese early on in the year was to have President Obama and President Xi agree together and announce together what their targets were going to be for the Paris Agreement just a year later. After 10 months of lots of talking and a lot of negotiating with the Chinese, we managed to pull this off. Both that the countries were announcing their positions, their targets, but also that a number of issues were woven into a 2 or 3 page, quite important statement between the two. They then walked down the aisle in the Great Hall of the People on a red carpet, literally, and it electrified the world. I mean, it was, first of all, it shocked the world because we really had kept this secret. And it said to the world, particularly the climate world, that if these two 800-pound gorillas, who had always been the antagonists years back, can actually get together at the presidential level and say, here's what we're going to do. Oh, and by the way, if there's any obstacles in the path, we're going to work together to remove those obstacles. That was just a huge event that gave countries who hoped but were skeptical belief, which is evidenced by the fact that as we got very close to the Paris start date itself, there was something like 180 countries had put forward their own targets. This was based on the notion that this is going to happen. Even though we've had all these disappointments, it's going to happen. So I think all of those factors contributed to getting it done.
What you're saying is that essentially the real work is done in the preparation and in the meetings around, or a lot of it.
This is a talking game. I mean, if you're going to do diplomacy, you better be ready to talk and to listen. My team would meet all the time in our windowless conference room, and we would develop ideas, talk through ideas about what we wanted to see happen, what we thought would be the posture of another country. And then you go and talk and you sit down and you get their perspective, and always it's a little different than what we've been saying to each other, right? And I had a great team. But it's always a little bit different if you actually go and sit and talk and listen.
How do you see that kind of US-China motor of the climate process evolving going forward, given the different context we're in now?
It was never easy before. It wasn't easy back in the Obama years either. But it's significantly more stressed now for a whole set of reasons. We're still the 2 biggest players in the world. We're still the biggest developed country, and China still likes to call itself developing, so that's fine. But I mean, China is the biggest emitter by far, more than twice the size of the US now. So these are really important countries. So for that reason, it's important to try to figure out how we can make progress together. And I think it's also important to have an issue where the 2 countries can be working together in some way that is relatively positive. I mean, I always had that logic in my head back in the day. It's just that it's more fraught now. But I don't think that takes away. I think, if anything, that adds to the importance of trying to understand each other and make progress.
Yeah. From the other side, I think you are seeing perhaps a rising tide of criticism that Paris isn't delivering what we need to keep safe. What would you say to people who feel skeptical, looking for perhaps other routes? Is it still fit for purpose?
I think that that it's important for there to be an international agreement. The nature of the beast with respect to climate change is that in order for decisions to be made, basically everybody has to agree. It's what's called consensus. And so you're just not going to get the kind of thing that is going to cause everybody to do exactly what you want. I think what you have built into Paris is strong language that is pushing countries to, first of all, put in targets and then to ratchet them up each 5 years. 2025 is the next ratchet point. It's going to be very important for Paris's credibility to see a strong set of targets put up for that period that will be 2025 to 2035. Paris depends on country action, and country action depends on there being a good Paris agreement, And the two have to be kind of mutually reinforcing. So the right kinds of what I would say salutary pressure needs to be put on countries, not just by the Paris regime, or the Paris Agreement, but by other countries, by their own citizens, to do the sorts of things they need to do. And you need to have an international agreement. You can't. I think the notion that let's just forget that, let's just get a group of 20 countries and do it. Well, the people you've cut out there is the huge number of developing and smaller countries whose only ticket to having any voice internationally is to have a multilateral system. I think it's fine and good to have lots of things go on outside of Paris that can then be brought back in. If 10 or 15 countries want to get together, agree to do X, Y, or Z, that's beautiful. It's not that it all has to come within Paris. But you can't get rid of Paris.
What would be as one of the architects of Paris, what would be your advice to the current generation of diplomats and leaders out there who are trying to make this system work, for what they need to do to kind of fulfill the potential of Paris in the next year, in the critical next year?
Well, look, I think that part of their job undoubtedly is to persuade their own governments, which is never easy. We live this year in a world where there has literally been biblical weather happening over and over and over again. The question is kind of, what are we waiting for? What sign, what signal are we not getting from nature that this is enormously important and enormously threatening? It makes it imperative for us to push the envelope as far as we can with respect to what action is taken. So I guess I would say to negotiators, first of all, make as much progress as you can internally to get the instructions that let you lay down what your country intends to do. It's fine to be frustrated at why more progress isn't being made in XYZ issue, but don't take that and therefore say, well, we're not going to agree to do ambitious things in the ratchet, because we have to have that ratchet. I think if we're talking about what is sometimes referred to as donor countries with respect to financial assistance, I think you've got to be mindful of how important it is to change the way finance is directed toward countries in the so-called global south. I think that's really important. It's not just a matter of what happens within the UNFCCC and the climate body. It's a matter of what happens in other places as well, like the G20. But we have to make progress here, because I think there are many poor developing countries who feel understandably like there's just not enough assistance coming to countries who need that, whether it's to build resilience or to build green economies, both. So I guess that's what I'd say.
As you look at the progress we've made and look at the problems we face, are you fundamentally optimistic or fundamentally pessimistic that we will kind of resolve the climate issue in a way that keeps the majority of people as safe as we possibly can and helps them live and thrive going forward?
I think generally, if I step back and look at what I think is the landscape in regard to climate change worldwide, I would point to three factors. The first is that the science of climate change and the impacts that we see from climate change around the world are coming much faster and much harder than anybody ever expected. So that's a fundamental factor. And again, I go back to, what are you waiting for, folks? We're seeing the warnings right in front of us. That's thing number one. Thing number two, we should take note of the fact that the progress in terms of clean technology, the green revolution, has proceeded at an absolutely spectacular rate. I mean, this is working so much better than any of the very best modelers and analysts thought 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. I mean, where we are with solar and wind and batteries and electric vehicles and heat pumps and on is just spectacular. And in areas where there's still lots more to do, such as heavy industry, steel, cement, so forth, there's tremendous innovative work going on all over the world. So we can do this at the level of making the transition which is a big thing to say. The problem, though, is factor number 3, which is that there are strong obstacles. And in my way of thinking, the biggest obstacles come from the fossil fuel industry, both with respect to what it does and with respect to the influence that it has. Because I think the degree to which you see governments around the world maybe doing a good deal, but not as much as they should, that can often be because they have strong fossil fuel interests and lobbies and whatnot, and so not enough is done. So I think that we can do this. The fact that we have the technology and the technology momentum and innovation that makes that even possible is something to be very optimistic about, but it's a race against time. And the science and impacts are very real, and the political resistance or failure to really act at the level that we need to is a very human thing, unfortunately, but it's a thing that we need to try to make real progress on, and we need the political will. But to get the political will, we need bottom-up action and belief and insistence and demand from citizens, and we need the norms to be built, right? I mean, that needs to build and build in order to get policymakers to do the right thing, but it's challenging.
Thanks so much for coming to speak. Thanks so much for writing a book about your work, which I think people find amazing. And just thank you for all the time, effort and grit you have put into helping move the climate process forward. It's very much a marathon, not a sprint, even if we have to be sprinting all the time during the marathon. So thank you very much,
Well,
Todd.
thank you for your work too. Thanks, and for E3G, it does great work. Thanks a lot.